You're listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview writers of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense books. I'm your host, Alan Peterson, and this is episode number 106. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be meeting Charlie Donlea, who is a USA Today and international bestselling author. His fifth novel, The Suicide House, will be released today, July 28, 2020. I received an advanced copy of The Suicide House, and it's one of the best books I've read so far in 2020. It's really original. It tells a story of a chilling murder featuring a forensic reconstructionist, Roy Moore, and her psychologist partner, Lane Phillips. And as a podcast, I really love the big role a true crime podcast plays in the story. It's a very top thriller, very suspenseful, with a lot of plot twists and storylines that come together nicely. Suicide House is available now, so go check it out at thrillingreads.com/sh. I highly recommend it. I had a great time talking with Charlie about his work, his journey as a writer, and a whole lot more. So stay tuned for my interview coming right up. Hi, everybody. This is Alan with Meet the Thriller Author. And for this episode of the podcast, I have Charlie Donlea. And he is a USA Today international best-selling author of Summit Lake, The Girl Who Was Taken, Some Choose Darkness, and Don't Believe It. And his latest novel, The Suicide House, will be published on July 28th, 2020. Charlie, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on here.
Thanks, Alan. Good to be here.
Tell us about your background, your writer's journey.
Different than most writers. I never had an aspiration to write when I was younger. I never read when I was younger. And as a matter of fact, when I get invited by English departments to speak at high schools, I always tell the head of the English department that I never read a assigned novel all through my high school years, and I want to make sure that they're okay with me telling that to the students. But I had a total aversion to reading. I just didn't like doing it, and never had any aspirations to write. And it wasn't until I was in college I picked up John Grisham's book, The Firm, and that was the first novel I ever read. And it just ended up being, if you love to read, which I now do, but it ended up being one of those books that you come across every so often. You know, every book you read you don't love, but when you find one of those books that you can't put down and you can't stop reading it and you can't wait to get back to it and you don't want it to end. That was the first experience I ever had with novel, and decided I was going to write a book someday, even though I had nothing in my past background that told me I would be able to do that, and no formal training on it. So it was in college that the seed was planted. And then when I finished college and started my career, I just secretly started on this dream of writing a novel. I ended up writing 4 manuscripts that all failed to find a publisher until I finally wrote Summit Lake and broke through with that book.
Those first 4 manuscripts, you never published those? Those are still in your digital box?
They're the trunk books. They're sitting in the trunk of at the foot of my bed. I tried really hard. When you finish a manuscript and it's really hard to let it go because it takes, as you know, so much effort to finish it. And I'm sure tons of aspiring writers who have started but never finished the manuscript. I mean, finishing a manuscript is just a huge accomplishment all by itself. And so when I sent that out to agents and I was getting hundreds of rejections, one agent finally called me and told me that he said, I just want to let you know that this manuscript, it will never sell. It's not good enough to sell. You shouldn't spend any more time on it. He said, I think you know how to write, but I don't think you know how to write a thriller. So his advice was put that book away to the side, forget about it, and go study how to write thrillers by reading a bunch of thrillers and kind of reading it from the author's perspective. And when you sit down to write a manuscript, try to write it from the reader's perspective. And so that's what I did. It's hard to put it away and to give up on it, but that's what I did. My second manuscript that I wrote, I ended up finding an agent with that manuscript. But even together, my agent and I couldn't sell it to any publisher in New York. So I put that one away after a couple of years and wrote a third one with the same luck, which was none. She liked it and we worked on it, but we couldn't find an editor or publishing house to buy into it. And then finally, I wrote my fourth book, which was the story of a law school student who was murdered in this small town at her family's vacation house, and the investigative journalist that goes to this small town to kind of look into her death. And we named that town Summit Lake and sent it off to New York, and we had 4 publishing houses really interested in it, right as soon as we sent it off. So it was a long journey, but and kind of an interesting one, because I wasn't the kid under my blankets reading books in the middle of the night or writing short stories when I was 10 years old. I just never had an interest in it. But here I find myself writing a novel a year now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I saw that from your website when I was doing my research, and that you said you didn't read your first novel till you were 20. What drew you to The Firm? I'm kind of curious. What drew you to that book?
I think, people ask that. I can't even remember. I think, Tom Cruise was, going to be Mitch McDear. I think my dad had read it. And I don't even know why I picked it up, because it was so uncharacteristic for me to, I never had read a book before. But when I did, I remember I read it in 6 days. And I was, couldn't wait to get back from class to pick this book up and read it. And I realized I had, all these years of potential reading I had wasted. But I've made up for it since. I'm a big reader now, and that's mostly my hobby. Instead of TV or movies, I like to read novels.
Yeah, that's a funny though. I feel like connection with The Firm, because that was one of the first books for myself too. I grew up, reading. My dad was a big reader, but he read like James Michener, and he's great. But those are huge books, and they're so hard to get through. And
yeah.
So I just kind of read what my dad had, Zane Grey, stuff like that. And then the first book that I got on my own because it was such a big hit was The Firm, and I read that, and I'm like, okay, now I can see what this is all about.
Yeah, and that's why The Firm, I don't know, I think in hardcover, it's probably 350 pages, but I mean, it's just enough. I have read huge 700-page books, but it's hard, no matter how much you're into it, it's hard to stay steady through the middle of those really long books. So, I've always, when I write, I always aiming for, 80 to 100,000 words on my manuscripts, which puts you right between 300 and 400 pages, which I think is a pretty good sweet spot. When I was started to read, I remember picking up Robert Ludlum's book, The Bourne Identity, which was the third one in the trilogy. And for some reason, I was like, I'm going to read this great big book, because reading was, kind of a cool thing to me suddenly. And I read them in reverse order, the Bourne books. But yeah, those are big, thick books, and it takes you a lot of concentration to get through those. So when you first start off, like your dad's reading these massive books, I would tend that would probably turn you off. You got to read something a little more manageable.
Yeah. Then that's cool. They're making you read all these other books. So yeah, you kind of got a aversion to reading, and then so it's kind of great to discover your own path. Yeah. Sure. So can you tell us about your latest book, the Suicide House? And I'll say I started reading that a couple of days ago, and it's a great book. I love the beginning. It's just the beginning is just dark. I'm not going to give anything away, but can you tell us about the Suicide House and how it all came together for you?
Yeah. So so the Suicide House actually stars a protagonist named Rory Moore, who I first wrote about in last year's book, Some Choose Darkness. And I always said I would never write a series. That just wasn't anything I wanted to do. But when I turned in last year's book, Some Choose Darkness, all my editor here in New York and my editor in Australia and Brazil, they all loved this character so much that they sort of encouraged me to write another Rory Moore story. And the two books can be read in either order. I was very careful not to make the Suicide House a continuation from Some Choose Darkness. They're two separate stories. If you read the Suicide House and you like Rory, you can you go back and read and Some Choose Darkness. But so I sort of hit the ground running when I was writing the Suicide House, because I already had my protagonist mapped out. But the Suicide House is a story about these two students that get killed in this kind of brutal slaughter at a elite boarding school in Indiana. And a teacher gets accused and convicted of the murders, and it's kind of wrapped up quickly, and the case is solved. And but what happens over the following year is that students continue to go back to this abandoned boarding house where the murders took place, and they're killing themselves. And so, rumor starts spreading that the kids were playing this sort of urban legend game called The Man in the Mirror. And rumor starts spreading that the game is still going on in the school. And a popular podcaster ends up starting a podcast called The Suicide House to sort of revisit the murders. And when he does that, he calls in Rory Moore and her partner, Lane Phillips, who's an ex-FBI profiler, to kind of help him figure out what is going on in these students' minds and why they're going back to kill themselves. And as soon as Rory and Lane start investigating, they realize that something truly is still going on inside Westmont Prep and inside the school, and that the students know more than they're letting on. And that's the premise. And then the story takes off from there, following their investigation of the murders and the suicides.
And can you tell us a little bit about your characters, about Rory Moore and Lane Phillips? How did they come to you? Are they based on your research or people that you know?
Definitely not on people I know. I'm always really careful not to try to put people I know into my books. But Rory is a really sort of complicated, fun but dark character. She is she's a forensic reconstructionist, so she works on cold case homicides, and she has this uncanny ability to see what other investigators miss. And this ability comes from her being on the autism spectrum, and she suffers from OCD. And when she was a kid, this autism and the obsessive compulsion had the ability to sort of derail her life as it does in her adult life. But instead of shipping her off to a therapist or a psychiatrist or trying to treat her with medication, she had a really intuitive aunt who saw all these quirky tendencies in Rory and knew that she needed an outlet for these obsessive compulsive urges. And if she didn't have that outlet, that's what was going to derail her life. So her aunt introduced her to the art of restoring antique dolls when she was a little kid. And this art of restoring dolls is an outlet for Rory's obsessive tendencies, because in her real life, Rory has to push to the side all these urges that she has to, lock and unlock a door 100 times and check her speedometer and check if the stove is off, and all these, obsessive compulsive urges that would derail her life normally. She takes all of these and she sort of compartmentalizes them and puts them to the side. And then when she gets into her workshop, she unleashes all these urges and tendencies and the need to do things meticulously and redundantly. All of those things are demanded when she's doing doll restoration, and that became a way of, through her childhood, of sort of being a normal person. And then when she's in her workshop, she can sort of display who she really is. When she becomes an adult, she realizes that the way her mind works as an autistic person, and the way her mind wants to, cannot leave things alone after she sees things, which is what happens with obsessive compulsives. She realizes that those might be, detriments in real life, but they're actually very useful in the occupation of solving cold cases, because again, she has this mind that allows her to look at a cold case and see things that other investigators have missed. But at the same time, once she sees a case that's unsolved, her mind doesn't rest until she's able to solve it. And so she only does one case at a time, and she chooses her cases really carefully. And she was very reluctant to get involved with this Westmont Prep case in the suicide house. But her partner sort of talked her into it. And, ultimately the case gets solved from Rory looking at all the details that are already there, sort of hidden right in front of the investigator's sight. And she's the one who ends up uncovering it. So that's Rory Moore sort of in a nutshell. A complicated character, but really sort of relatable to a lot of people, because I think we all have some sort of quirky tendency about ourselves that we, I don't know if we try to hide it or we try to keep it away from, it being on display entirely. And Rory has this, and she's able to do it not only in her private life with the doll restoration, but she's able to use those tendencies in her occupation, and she does really well at it.
Yeah, I think that was real fun with your books and your characters. Is they're not like the perfect super cop. They got their flaws and their issues. This makes it more fun, more compelling to read.
Yeah, I think my earlier novels my earlier manuscripts that never got published. I mean, I think that's what I was, going for. The Mitch McDeers, the perfect lawyer who's going to take down a corrupt firm, or the Jason Bournes, who an assassin that can never be killed. That's what I sort of was reading, and that's where my mind was going. But a lot of the characters in my books, they're challenged by something currently, or there's some part of their past that they're trying to overcome, and they use whatever they're working on currently to do that. And it's worked pretty well. Every time I write a book, I always hear from readers, is this character coming back in the next book? And that started with my Summit Lake, when the Kelsey Castle, who's the investigator, everyone wanted to see her in another book. And then I wrote The Girl Who Was Taken, and that the protagonist there is kind of a badass medical examiner, and she was really popular, and people wanted to know if she would come back. So every book I hear from readers, hoping that the main character comes back, and Rory's been the first one that I brought back.
Do you find that to be a challenging to do that? Because you say you never really thought about a series before, or once you got started, it all kind of fell into place.
Yeah, the timing was a little strange when I wrote The Suicide House. So I had The Suicide House is the first in a 4-book deal that I signed with my publisher, and there was like a little. Not to get too deep into the publishing sort of business side of it, but there was like a delay in what we were going to do and when this contract came. And so when I finally signed the contract, you're very excited. And once the champagne bottle empties, you realize I got to write 4 books in 4 years. It starts to dawn on you. And so I only had about 9 months to write The Suicide House. So the idea of hitting the ground running with Rory Moore, a character that I knew very well from writing her in just the previous book, was sort of a welcomed idea, because I didn't have to go through the whole process of a new character sketch and getting to know them. And you've written a number of books. When you first write a brand new character, I mean, it's like the middle of the book before you really know them very well. And much of what you write about them at the beginning is, when you go back to read it, it's preposterous. I mean, that's not the character that you've written by the end of the book. So there's a lot of writing and rewriting that goes on with every book. But I was a little pinched on time, and so starting with a character that I knew, like I said, was easier for me than starting all over. What I did was I listened to Some Choose Darkness on Audible, just so I can refresh myself of Rory's tendencies and her appearance and every little detail. Because when you write, when you're writing a character in 2 books, everything has to match. And so writing a huge long series still seems daunting to me, because you just wonder if you're going to forget about something that something you gave this character, a characteristic that you gave to her in the first book. You don't want it to disappear, and so you have to keep that character alive in your mind year after year. So interesting concept. I don't know that I'm going to do 20 Rory Moore books. When I'm 60 years old, maybe I'll look back and say, yeah, I've done 20 Rory Moore books. I didn't think I was going to, but right now I have, I'm writing a standalone for next year. And that would be book 7. And then book 8, my editors have asked if I could go back to Rory for either book 8 or book 9. So I think Rory has at least three stories. And then, we'll kind of see from there.
And what is your writing process? Do you outline these, or do you just start writing them?
Yeah, that's such a murky question. I try to do outlines. John Grisham always says his bit of advice is don't start the first sentence of a novel until you know what the last sentence is going to be. And I think I have a little bit of that in me. I don't really start writing until I have a bunch of ideas written down, and I have an idea of how I want the book to end. I've done both, where I've just sat down, had no idea what I was going to write, and started writing. That's how I did Summit Lake. And it's an interesting way to do it. It's kind of a torturous way to do it too, because so much of what you write, you end up having to delete and get rid of and trash, because you're meandering. You're not going towards this final goal that you had in your mind. You're just kind of going with the flavor of the day. And so it takes me longer. It took me a long time to write Summit Lake. When I sat down to write The Girl Who Was Taken, it was one of those, that same thing. I signed a 2-book deal. And after we were done celebrating, I sat down, I said, I got to write a book in a year. I've never done that before. All my manuscripts that failed to sell, they took me years. Each one took me a number of years to write. And Summit Lake was like a work in project. It was like a work in progress for 2 or 3 years. So now I'm sitting down. I have 1 year to write The Girl Who's Taken. So I remember I actually had to turn in an outline to my editor. I had a due date for when the outline was due. And I was writing the manuscript, and I had like a clunky outline that made no sense to anybody but myself. So I tried to organize it, and I turned it into my editor, and he said, it's okay. There's some weird things about it. I don't know if it's going to work, but let's see. I think you have enough to write the manuscript, and we'll go from there. So when I turned in the manuscript, he calls me up, my editor does, and he says, I really love the book. It has absolutely nothing to do with the outline you turned into me, because, I wrote the outline, but then the story kind of took off on its own in different directions, and I scrapped the ideas and just sort of went with the book. So I don't outline perfectly, but I outline a lot. And specifically, like in the middle of the book, what I need to do is I need to write down what has to happen in the next few chapters. And if I can get that organized, then the writing process is so much easier, and it's much more enjoyable, because 1,000 words or 2,000 words come so much easier when I have an idea of what I'm trying to accomplish with those writing sessions. There's times, I think, when you have to write yourself out of a rut, but writing yourself out of a rut, you get out of the rut, but what got you out of there is mostly nonsense. For me, anyways. That's just the way my mind works. So I do sort of a rough outline, and then in the middle of the book, the creative process always sort of veers me away from that outline. And people ask, because in my books, and in a lot of thrillers and mysteries, there's the twists and the surprises. People have asked, how did you know that was going to happen? Did you know that was going to happen? And that's certainly not how the writing process works for me. I mean, I will write, maybe 50 pages and go back in and rewrite those, and then write another 50 and realize that something I revealed during the first 50, now I want to keep that a secret from the reader. And I'll go back and write those 100 pages over and put in the twists and take out the clues and make it more subtle, so that when I turn in my first draft, it's, I've probably been through the book 5 or 6 times by then, the manuscript 5 or 6 times, especially to, put in the red herrings and and drop a clue, and but make sure it's not so obvious that that the surprise or the twist is seen. So outlining is only for the first draft, and then you're going back and you're just kind of reworking it to try to make everything perfect. And by the end of it, I think most writers will tell you they've been through their manuscript dozens of times by the time they're done with the drafting of it.
And what do you use to write and to write your books? Do you use like Word doc, Microsoft Word, or something else?
Yeah, when I first started, I was not the best. I was not the best typer, of all things. So it was sometimes it was easier for me to jot notes down by hand, and then to write on a computer just using Word. That's what I use now. After a few novels, my typing skills are pretty solid now. So when I try to write stuff down, my mind is working faster than I can scribble it down on the page. So in the middle of my manuscript, if something comes to me, I put it on all caps, I put it in red, and I just start typing the idea. So because I can get it on the page faster. And then I take that idea and we put it, I cut and copy it over to another document. So I have all these that goes with my outline. But almost everything I do, besides early notes and just by the minute notes, which I write on by hand, everything I do is on the computer.
And the
best tool for me is when you're sort of doing the final edits and you do a chapter by chapter outline. The best thing for me is when I have like a couple sentences that explain what every chapter is and the purpose of it and what's revealed in it. And that comes at the end. And when you do that exercise, it really allows you to get rid of any unnecessary parts and unnecessary chapters, or certainly unnecessary parts of a chapter, because you're just trying to zero in on one specific goal for that chapter. So if people really saw the writing process from start to finish, it's so, as it's so messy. Mm-hmm. It's not like you sit down and write a book in a couple of months and start editing it. That's not how it works for me, or for most writers.
And do you put in a lot of research into your books?
Yeah, I think you have to. I don't know how you wrote a book before the internet.
Yeah.
The internet is like, you got to find out what street the medical examiner's office is. It's a few clicks away. You want to find out what the name of the product they use to look for blood and bleach. You can find that in a minute. So there's a lot of research we do through the internet. The Girl Who Was Taken, which was a book about a medical examiner looking for a missing sister. There was a lot of medical research that went into that book. And the tricky thing with research is that, you need to cherry pick the most exciting and the most interesting parts of an occupation or whatever you're researching. And you need to be able to boil it all down to just the interesting parts. So research isn't always the most fun. For Don't Believe It, part of our research, my wife and I, we went to St. Lucia and this beautiful resort called Sugar Beach Resort, which is where the murder takes place. So that sort of research is really fun. Reading about autopsies and trying to figure out the most interesting thing about autopsies is a little bit more challenging than laying on a beach in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's like always have your murders happen in exotic locations so you can go and research them.
Always a good plan. Yeah.
Yeah, and so now I wonder too, now with everything that's been going on here with the pandemic, have you found that changing your writing process or your research? Because now you really can't go to places as we could before.
Yeah, I mean, there's been no travel, but fortunately, travel is not the only form of research. With the stay-at-home order, it was, you're a writer, right? I mean, it's like you got to stay home at work. It's like Well, that's what we do anyways,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's just trying to stay disciplined and make sure you get your words done each day. When you have all day to do nothing because nothing's going on, it's a lot easier to procrastinate than when you're super busy and you only have a couple of hours or 3 hours to get your words done. So there was a little bit of battling that. I think we're kind of back to our regular schedule now, thankfully. So, I'm just an early morning writer. I get up really early, 4:30 or 5, and try to get my words done. I shoot for about 1,000 words a day. Today on Wednesdays is like my big long writing day. I haven't barely left my desk today. And I just try to get 2,000 or 3,000 words on every Wednesday. If you can do that, you can finish a book in a year and edit it and all that without running into too many deadline troubles.
Yeah, that's the hard part, having those deadlines looming.
Without a deadline, though, I tell you, there's nothing to keep you on track.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's always time to do it tomorrow if you don't have a deadline. And there's always another tomorrow. So it's a tough, vicious circle you find yourself in.
Yeah, it can snowball out of control very easily.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
4 months turns into 2 really quickly, and then you're like,
yeah,
now what?
Or you start doing research, and the next thing you know, you wasted hours on YouTube or whatever. Yeah,
I know it all too well.
Yeah. And so, do you still, with your busy writing schedule and everything, do you still find time to read?
Oh yeah, Audible especially I've been really into Audible lately. When we were at stay-at-home, lockdown, we were doing a lot of home repairs and painting some rooms in the house. So I was listening to a ton of books on Audible, but I always have a book going. Whether it takes me a week to read or a month, I'm always in the middle of a book. Right now, I'm reading Riley Sager's Home Before Dark. It's his latest, but I'm never without a book. And typically, I'm reading one and listening to one. So I'll get through. Every month I'll get through at least a couple of books.
So what's the next?
Currently, my next manuscript's due in September. I'm sort of right in the middle of that, right in the weeds of that, and new character. All new characters, nothing is carried over. In a lot of my books, if people have read all my books, you'll see a little bit of little nuggets in each book from the previous one. Summit Lake was my first book, but the town shows up again and Don't Believe It. Olivia Cuddy was the doctor and the girl who was taken. She makes a cameo in Don't Believe It. So there's little parts of each book sort of follow the next one, as sort of a fun thing for readers to look for. But the standalones, that's what I'm writing now, and hopefully in September I'm done. I get to take a little bit of a break. Somehow I think 4 months or 3 months from now it's still going to come so quickly that I'm going to have trouble, but we'll see. I'm going to keep every day, stay to my schedule. I'll see how we do. And
okay, so before I let you go, I always like to ask my guests about any advice for aspiring writers. I know I have some of the listeners are writers themselves. Any advice for them?
Realize that a lot of the stories you hear are the exceptions of getting a huge book deal and getting your first try and getting a movie deal. Those are all things that we all shoot for. The rejection is such a huge part of the publishing business that just if you want it badly enough, just don't give up. And if you got to put a manuscript to the side, just count that as part of your experience, and it taught you that you can do it, and that if you can do one, you can do another one. So if you don't make it with your first manuscript, sit down and get going on another one. It took me 4 before I made it, and my 6th book. I'm writing my 6th book now, and I'm contracted for 8. So it's just stick with it and don't give up.
Okay, and so then your website, so people can find you, is charliedonlea.com. That's probably the best place to find all the information about you.
For sure, yeah. Charlie Donlea, it's spelled Donlea. A lot of readers find me on Facebook also, Charlie Donlea author. A lot of what I do on Facebook, I just sort of is redirected from my website. So those would be the 2 best places to find me.
Okay, and then the Suicide House will be out July 28th. I got an advance copy, thank you, and I've been enjoying it, so I highly recommend the listeners to go pick that up when they
nice.
listen to
Keep me posted when you finish it. Let me know how you like it.
All right, will do. All right. Thanks a lot, Charlie. It was nice talking to you.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Meet the Thriller Author podcast. Be sure to visit thrillerauthors.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover great thrilling reads. If you enjoy the podcast, I'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review to it, wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast, be it iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, wherever it is that you're listening to this right now. I would appreciate it. And please do check out my own thriller novels over at my website at alanpeterson.com. Until next time.